Hello, everybody. My name is Jonathan Podolsky. I am the Managing Director of Experience Strategy at MadPow. This is Personas, the cause of and solution to all of life's problems. This is actually a direct stolen quote from the greatest quote of all time, which is from The Simpsons, "Beer, the cause of and solution to all of life's problems." Thank you, Homer Simpson. I stole that one. As I mentioned, I am the Managing Director of Experience Strategy at MadPow. And I have a pretty interesting job. What I do is I research and I understand the nuanced experiences for what users or patients or customers or passengers go through, and to basically to understand what their plight is or their saga of their different experiential journeys. It isn't necessarily about what happens in a digital realm or what happens in any one type of physicality or channel, but basically using a service design methodology saying, knowing that there's all these different potential touch points out there, what is the overall experience for a user? It is rather an interesting job. I highly recommend it if anyone's looking for a career change. On a Tuesday, I could be looking at how an OR team is triaging issues with mechanical devices within the actual OR. So if they are using a surgical stent device and it breaks, what happens? And can we design a new methodology, a new progress to adjust to that or something to that extent? At the same time, also looking at things like how an individual shops for or buys an appliance, or how they get their blood taken. Being a patient, what is that whole phlebotomy process like? Or even something like, how do you order a beer? So if you go to a Holiday Inn or Holiday Inn Express, if you order a beer, that's something that I actually help design, or what that kind of conversation is. Everything around us is designed experiences. They're everywhere, and it's aspects that we can focus on. What makes my job interesting and always needed in terms of advocating for holistic design or solutions that are kind of oriented towards individuals is that the number of ways that we can engage with a customer, with a user now, is always growing. Even 3 weeks ago, I wouldn't be talking about the fact that individuals would be now wearing a small digital device on their wrist that could be part of this overall user or customer experience, but this is the new reality where types of touch points, modalities of touch points are always growing. The number is always exponentially exploding, it seems, at this point. And not just the way that we're engaging with customers, but the level of complexity as to what a customer can do is also evolving over time, to the extent that a few years ago, we probably didn't think that we could actually purchase a home online or completely manage the x-rays that we just took at a doctor's office. But the ability to do complex things that were once either automated behind the scenes or required a complex structure of staff and services could now be on the onus of a user. So the complexity is increasing, the ability of an individual is increasing, and the number of ways that we can engage is also increasing. And what this really means is that fundamentally, the understanding of the behaviors of a user are immensely important. My job is to advocate for a single individual and what their experiences are like, what their emotional states are, what their needs and expectations are. What I do is go to companies and I shout to the rooftops as much as I possibly can the plight of the user, what they're actually experiencing. And from that point, to advocate for their needs specifically. And the way I do that, or the methodologies adjust or change all the time, but the whole point is to instill empathy as much as possible into the situations of an individual. And the tools that we do that are embedded in a process, so to speak. Specifically looking at the fundamentals of creation, of design, whether it's a UX-based design, it could be architecture, it could be product, it could be really anything, but the sense is that research is at the core of this as much as humanly possible, and that advocating for the user must evolve from an understanding. And to do that, there are many different processes and there are many different methods to make that happen. But at the end, there are a few different tools, things that I use every single day to advocate for that individual, to try to instill that sense of understanding and empathy. One of those is journey mapping, and we actually heard a little bit about journey mapping light earlier today. A few talks that I've talked to have mentioned this in terms of a potential solution path, or as a process, or as a model for advocacy and for influencing design. And we use at MadPow journey mapping all the time. It's a rather important tool to say, okay, there's an essence of of an experience, but what are all the different factors that are involved in that? And there are many out there in terms of what an individual user is experiencing, and then all the different influences outside of the brand or the so-called brand umbrella of a defined experience. So to understand what those are and to also associate what a user is going through with the specific touch points that they're interacting with, and then also linking that as much as possible with the operational side of things. What is the back-of-house processes that are happening? What are the consumer-facing or the user-facing touch points that actually exist there? And then from there, what are the systems or the backstage systems that are supporting that front stage aspect? This is a rather complex dynamic of different things that have to happen to go from something as simple as purchasing a movie ticket online or ordering a beer at the bar. There's a cascade of different elements that must take place and must work together to actually evolve into a design. To illustrate this, let's talk a little bit about my favorite thing, which is coffee. This is basically a model of a journey map and why these are so important. So we could take a user, take an individual, and say, okay, today we're going to research you, we're going to shadow your experience. There's all these different methods we can do this, but we're going to see how you as a single person would experience purchasing a cup of coffee. So a person walks up to a street where there are many coffee shops, and there's some sort of mental process or decision happening that says, this will be the coffee shop I go to. There's some sort of brand evolution or some sort of cognitive thought process there to say this selection versus another. I walk up to the front. There's physical touch points. There's the architecture. There's the signage. There's the front door. There's this perception of threshold and how you walk into an overall space. There's some sort of communication that the structure is doing. There's something like a menu or a conversation that's happening with a barista. Maybe he's kind of a pissed off barista because he's had a long day and it's 3 o'clock and he doesn't really want to deal with you right now. But there's a conversation that's happening. So the number of touch points are always increasing at this point. There's a physical space. There's printed material. There's a human-to-human interaction that's happening. And then there's a backstage process, right? This could be the barista making your espresso. It could be the noises of the latte machine. It could be the supplies that are actually producing that coffee. And then there's an end product, right? There's a delicious cup of joe at the very end. And what happens here is that if we look at that experience, but look at it specifically from the nuanced perspective of a single individual, we can ask that individual questions. And we can basically see, how did these different touch points or these different sequences of events resonate with your expectations? How did the parking go? Why this place is not a competitor? And this can't happen if we're looking at large demographics or looking at a holistic experience with multiple different people coming in. Logistics of that are very, very difficult. But if we're looking at this from a single perspective or a single human being, then we can ask these questions. And we can ask multiple different questions to multiple different people and see if there's a pattern in place. This is the power of a journey map, is to look at this and actually be able to answer some of these questions. The most important thing, though, about journey maps is not the focus of the experience that is, quote, under the brand umbrella, but being able to expand that out. Because we're looking at a single individual, their story does not end or begin at that coffee shop. We as human beings, we do not divide or bucket experiences by the clean boundaries of a brand. It just doesn't happen that way. How you came to this hotel is how you mentally associate this hotel at the same time. This has actually been a problem with hotels for years, where the traveling to or getting to a hotel is almost always associated with the brand of the hotel, even though they don't own the taxi service, they don't own the van service, they don't own the transportation. So if that's a nightmare of a process, you blame the hotel and you probably won't go to that hotel again. It's just this kind of associated experience modeling that happens. Well, we can actually use this as a tool while looking at customer experiences and say, okay, what are these outside influences? What else is happening at the same time that could tell us a story? Was parking an ungodly bitch to get to that overall coffee shop? It's like any place in Boston where it's a 35-minute process just to have a 5-minute experience in terms of finding a place to actually park. Did you have an entire carload of kids with you? If you have 6 kids screaming, you do not sit down and enjoy a delicious, rich latte. That's not the overall experience that's going to happen there. You're going to get out as fast as you got in and pray that nothing happened in between. Or we can even stretch this really far back and say, at home, what is your experience? Do you have a really fancy latte machine? And if that's the case, then your perception is going to change in terms of what rich coffee is, because you've been drinking really bitter coffee for a long time, and you're going to want really, really bitter coffee when you go to a shop. That changes the overall demographic of the product. This kind of modeling works both ways, right? So we don't have to just necessarily go back in time from when the experience starts, but after the fact as well. what are the strange behaviors that are happening outside of that? Do you take your latte and then you go home and you just dump a whole lot of sugar in it, which is a cardinal sin of latte fans, but some people do that because maybe it's actually too bitter or too dark, and that's actually an issue that we can then inform the overall product. Or maybe you're just really weird and you order lattes to have there, and then you have a giant Duracell-shaped thermos, and you just pour your latte in it, and you go. That's a weird behavior, but these are the kind of strange behaviors that happen all the time, and to celebrate that or to acknowledge that this exists is rather important. Now, we do this to answer a few different questions in terms of what is the customer behaviors or the items that we need to understand from their perspective, and specifically the number or the type of nuanced aspects for the business overall, right? So there's the process side of things like training and policy and the operational side, and that's what we can start to capture in terms of journey mapping. And at the same time, there's customer behavior. And customer behavior is rather important because we design towards that. In most models, customer is centric, customer is core, and there's so much evidence out there that says that those business models where customer centricity is core and primary, that's where the success happens, that's where quick evolution happens, and that's where brand loyalty and advocacy starts to actually evolve. In order to do that, we need to actually understand those behaviors of the customers. Just because we plucked one customer out and was able to capture their experience doesn't mean that we have every customer. If a brand only designed for one individual, that's probably not a very good model, right? Because, or you have a terrible business because you only have one customer, but that's actually not the case. There are a lot of different customers, customer groups, customer behaviors that make up a total customer population. So what we then need to do is segment those out or figure out a way of representing customers, but not tens of thousands of them, or forcing a system that makes us test for tens of thousands or to research for tens of thousands, but to look at it in terms of bucketing individuals into like behaviors so that we can then test for and evolve design based off of those smaller segments. And that's what personas allow us to do. Personas are fundamentally what I call a character sheet. Basically, if you were to read a book or a novel, at the beginning of that novel, there's usually some sort of introduction of a character. It is their behaviors, it is their practices, it is their wants, their needs, their desires. You start to associate and understand and empathize for that individual before the story usually begins. Or parts of that story are built to actually introduce that element of that persona, that individual, that character. That's what personas are doing. They're actually introducing a character as if it was an individual, a single person, with all the nuances of that individual. So things like their name, their photo, their relevant behaviors, some of their background information. That's the story that we're trying to tell here as much as possible. But parsing those out in ways that represent a larger demographic. So it may be a single individual that we're designing for, but they may represent all the people that really like bitter coffee, or all the people that prefer to go to the drive-through instead of going up to the barista or up to the front desk and ordering a cup of coffee. In a lot of ways, what we're building is quite analogous to video games. And if you are building a character, there's certain attributes or aspects that character has to represent, right? So we have like Marsha here, our patient, or Marsha, our coffee customer, or Marsha, the individual, in all of her basic information. In the behaviors that we would start to represent for Marsha could be about the design itself, about the industry, about coffee, about their wants and needs related to that. In the same way that a video game would be like, this is Marsha the mercenary, right? So it could be things like her attack ability, or her shield power, or her ability to snipe from 300 yards away. It's the same kind of ideal or the same kind of concept where we're trying to introduce the attributes of that character that overall will influence the experience that will happen after the fact. So it really represents things like the common traits and the aspects that we know we will be designing for. Now, the visualization of that is rather key and important, but there isn't really any one rule, so to speak, in the sense that if you were telling the story of this individual, it is a method of storytelling to basically build empathy for this one person or this one aspect. And how we do that, or the methods that we do that, aren't always just kind of clean sheets or single posters or a one-pager. It could even be a storyline itself. We could tell a quick narrative, a video, an image compilation, a storyboard, any way basically for you to understand, here's Marsha, or here's an individual, and they have certain traits, they have certain needs and certain expectations. The way we intend to do it is that to build kind of standalone individual deliverables, things that we know will live beyond a project or beyond a specific effort, so that specifically somebody else could use these or understand these at a very quick glance. We know that when it comes to the amount of time that any individual, whether it's a designer or a key stakeholder or a CEO has to kind of gain insight and expectations based off of these is a rather short amount of time. So quick hits, clean information, these are the rather important things to introduce when we develop and build these. So that is basically a quick introduction to what a persona is and some of the behaviors around them and why they actually exist. I want to talk about now is how we start to create these, and specifics around some watch-outs, some gotchas, some bad behaviors that I have seen over the course of the past 12 years of using personas. I've used them to define architecture, to build new service models, to reinvent Fortune 20 key consumer operation systems. And in that dynamic, I've seen them used where design departments or companies have built their own. I've seen situations where marketing, because they had that kind of key connection to the end stakeholder, build sets or variations in between. And with that in mind, there's certain qualities or traits or patterns that keep happening over and over again. The same, basically, 8 mistakes that we see that we try to correct as a consultancy when personas have already been developed or when there's an aspiration to build a new set of personas that need to advocate for an individual. First and foremost is this idea of behavior over demographics. And this is actually a rather important one where the way a company may look at their target consumer base often tends to be through quantitative metrics or measures that are related to things like demographics. It doesn't necessarily have to be demographics. It could be other things like purchase power or percentage of profitability yield or some sort of metrics that are basically defining individuals. And that's fine and well and good, and that's, I'm sure, very, very appropriate for things like marketing or for business dynamics or even for refinements of a business model. But when it comes to an overall persona base, what we are focusing on is not those specific items. It is about behavior first, because behaviors dictate solutions, they dictate design, because we're trying to correlate behaviors with solutions as much as possible. So when we start to define personas, they must be defined based off of a behavior that is part of the overall challenge of the design itself. So if we're looking at something like, say, going to a school online for the first time, it would not be so much the demographics around the courses that are selected or the major that is selected. It would be around the behaviors that are best for achieving and being successful doing an online program. And those are a lot different than the metrics that we see all the time. These could be things like the ability to study in loud areas or the ability to self-manage your time, because usually if you're doing an online school or an online program, you're also balancing a job at the same time. So all of a sudden, the types of things that we're looking at, the behavior metrics are a lot different than, say, the traditional marketing metrics that we would focus on. This is actually a dental insurance type company that was trying to figure out who their actual individuals were. And what told us the behaviors that we needed to parse were actually, in this case, based off of their job responsibility and their end task goal. Now metrics weren't based off of jobs or what their tasks were as an employee or an employer of a payor, of a provider, or of a patient. But that actually is the behaviors that marked how the solution should be designed towards. So that then governed how we start to segment these out and to actually create new personas, or to say, we know that there's an individual that is actually advocating for the patient or for the that is actually there as a customer service agent. We know that exists. It's not one of your target demographics, but we know that needs to exist as a persona because that's a direct impact to the overall customer experience. Let's go ahead and build Oscar that's in there, and a few others to that extent. So allowing that aspect to kind of dictate how we parse or how we define personas is rather important. The other aspect of this is this idea of a one-size-does-not-fit-all model. And this is not a case that you'll see all the time, but often when one department or an organization says, we will commit to and we will absolutely develop or design personas, they do so in a very generalistic manner, in the sense that there may not have been one specific design-oriented solution that warranted their creation. Instead, it was, we know that we are a company, and we know we have end users or end individuals, and because of that, we will build personas. And what happens, though, is that the individual that exists for a specific solution is not represented in that persona. So you could have Marsha, remember Marsha from before. Marsha goes to get a cup of coffee, but the same Marsha that is actually going to be prepped for surgery or has a rather acute issue medically or is out shopping for groceries is not really the same individual in terms of their behaviors. Their core behaviors stay the same, but contextual stressors, contextual aspects that would influence how they would react to situations changes. And we know that to be true. A lot of data says that just because one person represents a certain behavior type, when you introduce them to a certain situation, how they react, their stressors can adjust or modify their responses. And what this tells us is that personas need to be rather specific. And that if you have a general set that says, hey, there's Marsha, and Marsha likes to relax on the weekends and do X, Y, and Z, that is not reflective of the situation that Marsha may find herself in if we are tasked to design a solution around introducing a patient to an overall OR procedure. That's a very specific task. And how we start and one thing I want to make clear here is that just because we have generalized personas, that's actually not a bad thing. That's a starting point. And one thing that we've noticed is that design teams or UX teams are sometimes rather apprehensive to say, thank you for the starting point personas. Now we're going to reiterate these. We're going to add a little bit more understanding, a little bit more perspective, and make them specific to the nuanced needs of our design challenge. We don't hear that very often, but I think that's actually rather important. And a really easy tool to do that, to make this a reality, is something like an empathy map sequence. This is taking the fundamental aspect of an understood persona and then adding a little bit of contextual essence to that, a little bit of a scenario, a little bit of evidence based off of an individual situation or the design challenge specifically. And then with that, allows us to create nuanced additions. What is that person thinking, hearing, feeling, based off of that new context we just introduced that persona to. So we have the base generic persona and then basically a minutiae, refined perspective based off of a little bit of empathy mapping. It's a cheat sheet, so to speak, process, but does allow us to get rather specific in terms of our focus. With that in mind, in terms of being specific, one of the other traps I see all the time is about ambiguous details. This is about being not specific. And the classic example is, hey, there's Marsha. She has all these different behavioral attributes, and she loves long walks at the beach. The number of times I've seen in persona is something relating to or associated with long walks at the beach is all the time. Quick 10-second story. My first job years and years ago, my first project, when I was a design director, I was given personas, and one of them was named Mark. And Mark liked sailing, he liked hanging out with his kids, and he did, in fact, like long walks at the beach. That literally was the information that was on that persona, and I was then asked to translate that into how an individual purchases engagement rings. This is for an engagement ring company up in Canada. And the challenge here was that... he was already married? Huh? Scandalous. I actually didn't expect that, yeah. Mark had friends on the sailboat, and it wasn't his wife. No, the challenge is that if you add these type of ambiguous details in, how I translate long walks at the beach and how you translate long walks at the beach could be completely different. The whole point is that this eventually has to influence design. I am not the designer. I just advocate for the individual. When I hand this over to a designer, they go, "Oh, long walks at the beach. That's not grayscales. That's ocean tones." And maybe that's the case, but that's risking a lot on a translation of a rather ambiguous piece of information. And so being as specific as possible, acknowledging that design needs to be translated is hugely important. And with that comes kind of point number 4, which is that to acknowledge that this overall piece of evidence, that what we're creating here, this point of empathy, has to be translated by somebody else. And to be as concise as humanly possible in doing that. Avoid the ambiguous details. Avoid the fact that maybe the guy was already married, but that's a great piece of information. But knowing that that somebody else has to see this and actually use this. And this gets to a few different points. One is being concise, obviously, but don't get trapped in long narratives. And if your persona is starting to look a little bit like the Gutenberg Bible in the sense that it is like 122 pages of empathy or understanding, that's asking a whole lot of an individual for translation of that. Being concise, being short, getting the point across is rather important. And that puts stress back onto that other point where maybe you can't do that with a generic persona, but if you start to add nuanced perspective specific to the design challenge, then you can be very concise, very specific towards the overall solution and what you need to do. Next one, number 5, is this game of telephone. This is, as a consultant in what I do today as an experienced strategist, this one terrifies me all the time. In that if I actually produce something, I can guarantee you that I will not be there every single time another human being is going to read this. And that I can shout from the rooftops and advocate for this person in meetings and in the type of deliverables that I produce. But that doesn't guarantee that what I say or what is translated on that page will, over the course of time, be properly translated towards another person. We may start with empathy, but we may end up with cake or something to that extent. And this happens all the time too, where if we're rather ambiguous in our details or we're bearing a lot of content or context into the overall process, then we are risking that mistranslation. And I know that I can't be there down the line when this has been passed from a designer to a UX individual to a developer. And if they're still using these for solutions or for motivation, if we get to this point and they see cake instead of understanding the initial aspect of empathy, that is a huge red flag. And I myself, as the person producing the persona, has not done a very good job of being concise enough. Now with that comes this overall aspect of qualitative personas need qualitative research. If you are leveraging just quantitative figures to produce a persona, you are missing out on a massive amount of the overall nuanced behaviors that exist within an individual. This is massively and hugely important. We at MapHow almost never ever use qualitative data to start persona validation. It's actually the exact opposite, where it is going deep and going specific with individuals as much as possible. Having conversations, talking to individuals, having stakeholder communications. 1-hour conversations produce personas. Large surveys tend to not, where you may see behavior patterns, but the nuances of that behavior, the emotional state, conversations as to how they feel during certain aspects of what they're describing to you are rather important. And to do that, it is this qualitative side of things. That said, we don't just use qualitative, and I don't recommend that it's just solely qualitative data, because the whole point is that you can't boil the ocean, and to gather this perspective and to get this understanding through 10 individuals or 20 individuals is fine. And then use qualitative methods. Look at surveys, confirm your hypotheses around what you see and hear and observe with your qualitative side using surveys, using large data in that sense, but to never start there in that perspective. An example of this is that we can tell a nuanced story or start to introduce an individual, but pulling direct quotes I find to be a massively useful method or tool to advocate for an individual. To say, hey, when we're starting to categorize different aspects of where a design needs to go, to say, well, what if it's all about things about being tech savvy or time availability or mobility or the elements of a behavior that we know are rather important, to say, we talked to this individual, and they said exactly this, and to show a direct quote or to play a recording of an interview or to parse out elements of what we see, this is where the advocacy of the overall persona development process comes from. Up until this point, there's a lot of trust that has to happen between a client and a consultant or the individual that's building the persona set versus the person who's commissioned this. And they are relying on you to translate, but for you to actually stand up and say, here's exactly what we heard, this is exactly what we saw, and to embed that within your persona, that's where you start to get acknowledgement, that's where success starts to happen, and that's where you start to build trust between a client and as a consultant at the same time. Number 7, I think, is the most important one, and I will say this probably 16 times in a row just so you guys understand this. Never embed a design scenario in a persona. Ever. Ever. I'll say it again. This is how important this is, because I see this almost every single time. Never, ever, ever embed the design scenario, the challenge or the actions of that individual going through the design that you are tasked to do in the persona itself. That is a massive trap, and it happens all the time. If we start to add action or the sense of time into a persona, it's not a persona anymore. It is a strange hybrid journey map or strange hybrid persona and scenario combination where we've added this element of time into a persona. Personas are not time-based. A persona is a snapshot of an individual given context of what they're going through. So it is about their behaviors, it is about their expectations, it is about their emotional state. It is not about the fact that that Martha got up in the morning and she decided to get a cup of coffee, and so she hopped in a car with all of her kids and she went to go get that cup of coffee and she talked to a barista and it was a delicious cup of joe and she put lots of sugar on it. That is adding the context of a scenario. And when you do that, this is what happens. This is the trap. The trap is that if you have multiple different behavioral types or multiple different personas, and some personas are all about time or are oriented specifically towards one set of behaviors, and there's a second persona who is maybe a lot different or maybe completely different than that first. And we know that those two people actually represent most of our target audience. By assigning the scenario, by assigning context into that persona about the actions that are taking place, then forces the design to only solve for that individual. So this is actually a sample of that trap where there was actually 7 different personas of variations around comfort of technology and around mobile devices. And what happened here was that there were a few different design scenarios that had to take place, different design challenges. One being how to order prescriptions over mail versus a scan to refill type system, right? And because they chose a single persona and then embedded those different scenarios and actions into that persona, the design team then designs only for that persona. So the nuances of this individual, who happened to be very tech savvy, happened to be very comfortable using a smartphone, a phone, and then the solutions were then based all around that individual. Great for this person, but the second persona was a 75-year-old individual, which actually represented a larger consumer base than the mic here did, who actually had no experience or very little comfort at using mobile devices when it came to managing healthcare or health-related information. And that was the trap that happened here, was that the solutions started to reflect, as they should, what happens within the persona. But we assign the scenario to the persona, and then because of that, that massive trap happened overall in terms of how the design happens. When you don't do that, when you take the nuanced behaviors of a persona out and instead hold that as one element and then introduce the journey, introduce the task flow, introduce the sequence of steps afterwards, it allows you to do this, which is to compare the behaviors and the expectations and the reflections of that design towards a larger continuum of personas, and to say, does this solution reflect the needs of one individual or one persona, but actually are completely and totally useless or counterintuitive to a different persona? This allows you to then to design not for one single denominator, but for all common denominators of your customer base, but to do so in a way that we can actually red flag or understand areas that are hugely successful for one, but maybe not for the other. And it allows us then to figure out, is there a common ground where we can design for a sequence of events or design for that task flow where it actually meets the needs for everyone, as opposed to just one small segment of an overall population. That methodology, that translation, that happens not just within the scenario builds or within journey maps. It could happen within the touch points themselves in terms of the ecosystem of ways we can engage with or interact with the customer. That can then say there are different ways of engagement from one persona to another. To know that and then to prioritize those is hugely important, both for myself and for clients at the same time. And I'll end on this last point. Personas are a great tool, but they are not the only tool, and a lot of times they're actually not even the appropriate tool to use. A lot of times the thought process is, we have a design problem or a specific solution that needs to take place, and if that's the case, we'll build a persona to reflect that, and that personas are the gold standard in terms of user advocacy or to advocate or to build empathy for a certain situation. And that's true. Personas actually are fantastically useful in that sense, but not always, and specifically because of all the traps I just mentioned, personas are rather complicated. They're not easy to build, and they do require a lot of translation or a lot of understanding from the person creating them to a design team or a production team or whoever is going to leverage them. There's risk there of mistranslation. And if the variances from one type of individual to another are minute or simple, then we don't need to actually leverage a persona to translate that for us. Persona is there to introduce the complexities of human nature and the variances of human behavior. But if we know that a design is only really impacted from something as minute as their ability to use a smartphone or their inability to use a smartphone, we don't need to build a very complex persona around that to actually translate that for us. Instead, we can start to build archetypes. And archetypes say there's one or two behaviors or simplistic forms of a single behavior that are represented in terms of a demographic or of our key user types. And to say, so instead of saying, hey, this is Mike, and Mike's an on-the-go businessman, and sometimes he's on his phone for work, or sometimes he's on his phone to call his wife, and he uses it for calendars and all these things. We've embedded basically one key variance in a persona, when in reality we could just have an archetype that says some people use smartphones and some people don't use smartphones. It can literally be that simple. And if that's the case, then we've mitigated the risk of mistranslation, and we've simplified the overall process. And sometimes the end solution, instead of it being a core set of really fantastic personas, is instead a small list of variance archetypes. And if we had that and we know that's there, then that is a much easier way of translating overall solutions. So that's it. 40 minutes on the dot. Any questions or? Oh, thank you. Yeah, so personas are, I think, kind of traditionally seen as like the beginning of a project, but in reality, I don't think it's actually the case. I think that there's a lot of kind of fundamental understanding that needs to take place, and stakeholder interviews or initial business analysis, but being able to look and see what we perceive as what the variables are within behavior that would impact the design. So we're almost putting the cart before the horse, so to speak, and saying, if there were going to be changes to this design, what behaviors would massively change that design? And is it inclination to use a mobile device or not? Or is it? It's a chicken and egg thing. Though, So we start by looking at what we think the variances are in a behavior set based off of where a design can adjust. So if we know that there's a specific design for ordering a cup of coffee, then we can say, okay, so what are the variations on that? Or what are the behavioral changes that would greatly impact that? How do you know you're? So we can actually hypothetically, we can actually model that, right? So if you do something like a service design blueprint model, that basically is a cascade effect of all the different core start and end results for that business system. So if a start result is walking into a coffee shop and the end result is walking out with a cup of coffee, that's one. And then there's another variation around drive up, and there's another variation around staying there to actually eat. There's another variation around whether or not you take it to go or you stay. So there's all the different there's basically a way of modeling an entire system, right? An entire operational structure that's front of house or on the user side. And then from there, if you task flow that, you'll see that there's massive different splits or variations within that to say, here's a point of decision where if a decision is made, you go from hopping in your car and leaving, or you stay and you drink your coffee there. And so we know, there has to be a behavioral nuance at that point of decision making that could be a variance in terms of a user. So if you're looking at an existing system or an existing structure, you can start to do that. And it becomes a rather complex, tangled, or complex web of different points of iteration or of interjection where the overall user path can split. And then that says, that means that there's a decision point. And is that decision point motivated by a behavior? And if so, what is that behavior? And then we say, so here are the behaviors that we think could potentially be influential. And then from there, that starts the first round of user testing or interview process, right? And I wouldn't say that from that gives us like the one set. That gives us that initial conversation. We ourselves are not doing a business analysis in terms of the customer segmentations. Sometimes we will if we have to, if those don't exist. But I haven't actually met a company yet that hasn't at some point said, who are our customers and what is their kind of so-called makeup? And those were either done by marketing or done by internal departments, but they're parsing those based off of non-behavioral basis. That's where we get into the issue of the demographics. So we know that there's certain related behaviors, but that doesn't mean that we know which demographic is actually correlating to that. So after all this, after we get through the behavioral segmentations, we can then ask the questions of, are those behavioral segmentations correlating with certain population statistics? And sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. And if it's not, then that's where we start to leverage surveying and qualitative data to start to associate demographics with specific behaviors.
Could you talk a little bit more about making personas behavior-based, but then also making sure not to make the design, a design scenario in there? So it's like, trying to improve cup of coffee and talk about behaviors about ordering a cup of coffee, but not actually getting a full scenario in there.
Yeah, exactly. So, so if you're the designer for a cup of coffee, what are the behaviors for that cup of buying a cup of coffee, right? So you can actually remove the scenario of, but look at what are all the mitigating factors for that. So taste, patience, associated with the number of individuals that are actually you're tagging along with, the level of social aspect of that individual, right? That will tell you if that person wants to chat with somebody within the coffee shop or get the hell out as fast as possible. There's ways of actually looking at the design challenge first and then asking what are some of the fundamental rationales, and that gets into like the archetypes. You can actually have a list of 6 or 7 defining archetypes that would influence a design, and then those are the ones you can start to then parse out for behaviors in a persona without actually getting into a scenario. One thing to that point though is that to add context to a persona, you could introduce elements of a scenario, but not the design you're actually going for. So you could talk about the fact that Marsha had a bunch of kids and she's stressed out that day and all these things, because that could reflect a lot of the behaviors that happen with a lot of your customers, but that isn't assigning that scenario you just gave to the actual design challenge you have today. So you can still tell that narrative story, but don't you dare combine the two with the actual design thing you're trying to achieve.
Hi, I've often had this challenge when creating a persona. The moment I'm putting a photo or a face or a picture to the persona, demographics tend to creep in.
Yes! Oh my God. Okay, so I actually employ comic book artists specifically to illustrate both journey maps and personas. And I swear, so what we did here was actually, these are all generic examples because that allows me to show them to you guys. And if you were in the room yesterday or 2 days ago when we had the conversation around, they're looking at this and going, you said no demographics, but you're having us draw human beings. So we have tried so many different ways of creating kind of, like, remember Pat from SNL? Like you can't tell the sex or the gender or the age or all that kind of stuff. And so we try to figure out, can we draw Pat and still have that connection to that individual? And I wish I could say that we've cracked the code on that, but other than doing like stylistic stick figure variations, of which we've done a lot of those in the past, that is a huge trap by doing kind of character sketches and then that not somehow inferring a specific demographic. At the same time, I need to get my customers to kind of build a relationship with this persona as much as possible. So an actual face is massively appropriate to say, hey, I understand, this is Marsha, that's Marsha, I get Marsha now. Like me and Marsha get this thing going on. That's so hard to do with a stick figure or a non-human representation. So I actually don't have a good answer to you for this one yet because this is a trap we've been trying to figure out as well.
So I have a question for you. I have created these personas, but adoption is low. There's a lot of, we already know the customer, we don't need this. I've been able to show them ROIs. How do you get people to start using these as tools?
We don't start with the persona. We'll start with a specific individual story. We'll say, look guys, this is what Marsha just went through. And Marsha was told that she needed to have surgery and we followed her, or we shadowed Marsha throughout this entire experience. And did you know that when she checked in, they asked for the same information that she had already emailed and mailed and sent and had in her pocket, and that because your 2 different systems weren't connected to each other, she got really confused and frustrated. She's really stressed out already. And when you start to do that, where you introduce the plight of the individual first, then they go from like, oh, we know them, to like, holy we did not understand that this person was going through this nuanced thing. How you get that perspective could be a formal presentation. My favorite way of doing it is to actually grab the CEO or the client or whoever it is in the room and force them to do exactly what the patient does. I did a lot of hospital design work, I still do. Having them sit on a gurney and get rushed through the ER as if they're actually going through the process, or for the phlebotomy project, having them come with us and get their blood taken, like actually understanding exactly what they're going through. Yeah, walk them out. Then they're like, oh my God, I didn't understand that we were failing at X, Y, and Z. And suddenly, that's like a reset button. And then all of a sudden, they're open to actually understanding their patients a little bit further, or their users, and the overall system of process that takes place. So getting the stakeholders to follow you through the actual shadowing process, whatever the process is. I've dragged my clients through surgical centers, ORs. They've been with me through industrial factories for paper making, literally anything where they can actually understand the real process so that they see what I see. That starts the reset to actually have that conversation. Cool, thanks guys.